Today I'm presenting on Chinese medicinal trade during the Cold War Hong Kong. I want to begin the presentations with a story. So 2 years ago, I started conducting oral history interviews with Chinese medicine practitioners and companies owners. 2 years ago, I met Ms. Zhu, the owner of Leung Yihin, a business that began in Guangzhou in the late 19th century. She's now in her 90s and still running the medical companies. So technically speaking, Leung Yihin is one of the oldest medical companies in Hong Kong. She was born in Shanghai and came to Hong Kong in the 1950s. Her husband worked in a textile factory as a manager, so she did not suffer from the hardship of relocations. But her life had nothing to do with Chinese medicines at the time. She did not grow up in a medical family. She was just an ordinary housewife at the time. Her only connection with it was one of my favorite activities, which our center is going to do, mahjong. She was a mahjong buddy with the Yi Gu, the second elder sister in the Yu family, who actually owned Leung Yihin at the time. And Leung Yihin was a medical company established again in the late 19th century, and the Yu family also came to Hong Kong in the 1950s. So Ms. Chu might not be a doctor, but surely she was a winner over the mahjong table. According to her, over the years, she won a considerable amount of money from the Yu family, who also continued to borrow money from her. And until one day, her husband asked where was the money going. And having no choice, she asked the Yu family to return the money, who obviously cannot afford due to their declining businesses. And instead, they offer to sell the business to her. She initially rejected, given that she had no knowledge about medicines. But when her husband passed away in the early 1960s, she began to think about what to do with her life. Medicine then became an option for her. She decided to take over Leung Yihin in the late 1960s. So she did two things in the 1970s. She took a part-time diploma to receive training in Chinese medicines. So there's pictures of the school. She received her degree in 1979. And any observant readers might spot the flag and the photo behind, Sun Yat-sen, and also a Taiwan flag here. She attended a traditional Chinese medical school operated by the writers at the time. And during the 1970s, she also toured in Southeast Asia and North America, expanding her businesses in different countries. She later commissioned a Singapore company to promote and sell the medicines from Leung Yihin, as you can tell from the left pictures. So the circle one, 香港東南亞及世界各地. So another turning point in her life is the handover of Hong Kong. She decided to follow her son to New York and start her career over again. In New York, she set up a Chinese medicine clinic and also a beauty salon in New York Chinatown. Her clients at the times include Asian Chinese Americans and also African Americans who cannot afford healthcare at the time. But soon, economic downturn made her going back to Hong Kong in the 2000s, and she continued to run the business up to now. And that's what I know about her. Her transnational career is reflective to think about the history of Chinese medicine in Hong Kong. And in short, my project is interested in these practitioners and companies in Hong Kong and how they re-establish their global business and shape the history of Chinese medicines all over the world. So I'll keep it brief, but in general, most medical historians only interest in, for example, how the PRC states sponsor and subscribe to Chinese medicines as a kind of like the Chinese traditions during the PRC era, and they always look at it from state and intellectual perspectives. And I want to take a different side to look at how this kind of business history could be told in a new way to help us to understand the history of Chinese medicines. What I'm doing here today is taking medicinal trait 中藥材 as an access point to understand the Cold War, when the fever of Chinese medicines swept all over North America and Europe in the 70s. So what I'm trying to suggest here today is how Hong Kong became a global nexus of the medicinal trade between 50s and 80s, and surprisingly, I also want to challenge the myth that traditional Chinese medicines did not decline, but thrived under colonial rule, as people have already assumed in a different way. A key question here is I keep asking myself is why Hong Kong? I believe many of you have been questioning and wondering how could Hong Kong serve as a good case study for the global development of Chinese medicines. So after the Second World War, Hong Kong evolved to be a global manufacturing and financial center in the 60s and 70s. And the influx of refugees, we often talk about intellectuals, entrepreneurs, that they are drastically transforming Hong Kong at a time. And the field of Chinese medicine was no exceptions. A large number of practitioners of Chinese medicines and Chinese drugstores decided to relocate to Hong Kong at a time. Many of them are quite well known. For example, Yu Rensheng, Ma Baoliang, Wei Yuantong等. But again, why Hong Kong but not Taiwan? I need to stress that the decisions they came to Hong Kong is a deliberate choice, a calculated decisions that they made. Unlike many textile companies that relocated to Hong Kong, these medical merchants made similar decisions. So first, why they left mainland China? So under communist rationale, medical business was seen as essential. It should not be a business, but basic welfare provided to the public. So from the 1950s, the PRC confiscated the property and combined all these medical companies under state control. So why did they go to Hong Kong but not Taiwan? And Taiwan was also not a good choice at the time. From the 1920s, the nationalist government was hostile against Chinese medicines as an inferior, backward type of healing practice. They even planned to fully abolish the practice of Chinese medicine at a time, but failed. So in the 1930s and 40s, the nationalist governments introduced harsher tax on these companies, and it was obvious that to these companies, Taiwan was not a good choice. So why Hong Kong? Surprisingly, the colonial state did not suppress Chinese medicines. The colonial state was indifferent to the practice of Chinese medicine at the time. They neither suppressed or supported. The major reason was that the colonial state was afraid of triggering the Chinese communities, and banning Chinese medicines would lead to considerable oppositions from the Chinese. And instead, they sponsor and offer medical service based on biomedicines to the public, 西醫. They never acknowledged Chinese medicines, but only intervened when medical incidents and scandals happened. One incident here was the treatment of the eyes, as you can see from the pictures roughly. From the 1950s, many cases were reported to the colonial state about patients suffering from blindness after Chinese medical treatments, such as acupunctures by using old, rusty, and unsanitary needles for eyes. And some strange therapies, like this, in the news report. The staff lied to the patients that they could use worms, with a fancy term, 地金龍, for 妖人, to treat eye diseases. So it was obviously a scam, but it was one of the few moments when the colonial state would actually intervene and regulate. So Chinese medicines in Hong Kong developed against the Cold War geopolitics and this kind of ambivalent attitude by different states. For example, one of my interviews is with the owners of Wang Taiqiu Yachong, which was established by the Wang family in China in 1939. And I did an interview with the owners 2 years ago as well. And according to Mr. Wang, the Wang family had practiced Chinese medicines for 5 generations in Guangzhou. However, in 1949, the PRC state combined multiple companies into one under state control. So Wang Taiqiu, the owner at the time, relocated to Hong Kong in 1950s with his 6 sons and daughters. So this is the registrations in 1954, and this is Wang Taiqiu himself using his pictures as a trademark. And my interviewee, the son of Wang Taiqiu, vividly remember their life in Hong Kong. It was tough when they came to Hong Kong in the 50s, and they all lived in a small house and slept on the floor. So Wang Taiqiu came to Hong Kong and left the business in mainland China for other relatives. And like many others, they re-established their business in Hong Kong. However, their relationship with Hong Kong was somewhat more complicated than I thought. And just a few weeks ago, I was doing my archival work in Hong Kong and came across this letter. It was a letter issued by Japanese government in 1943. It was a moment of Japanese occupations in Hong Kong. Written in both Chinese and Japanese, it warned Wang Taiqiu to join the associations under Japanese control, which possibly served the purpose to centralize all trade at a time. But Wang Taiqiu didn't join in the end. But his journey in Hong Kong indicates a somewhat different pictures or stories from my oral interview. While my interviewee remembered they came to Hong Kong in the 50s, but his father already came to Hong Kong in the 30s and 40s. And these kind of patterns of mobilities between mainland China and Hong Kong in these decades were often messy and back and forth. So this is the kind of connections I'm looking at. And more indicative evidence is the numbers of practitioners and companies in Hong Kong. So registered practitioners increased from 300 to 900 within the 1950s, and manufacturers, retailers, and other stores also doubled in this period. So forgive me being redundant, but why Hong Kong again? And this time, I'm not asking why this company chose Hong Kong, but instead why Hong Kong was important in understanding the global history of Chinese medicines. I want to expand the scope beyond Hong Kong and think about the historical importance. So there's an advertisement published in 大公報 in 1961. As you can see here, the products were made by 羊城牌, which is under state control, and indicating 廣州聯合製藥廠. So it is a combined state-owned enterprise at a time. If we look carefully, these kind of products, they were detached from the original formula and the name. Initially, we will think about 惠元堂 for specific products, for 白鳳丸 or for other products attached to specific companies. But if we look at who were actually inside of the 廣州聯合製藥廠, you can see those three underlined in red, they actually came to Hong Kong. So if we look at advertisement and compare, you will see that these companies in Hong Kong, they were selling the same products, while the PRC state also exports similar products using similar formula by similar staff in the same time. And my point here is that in Cantonese, the PRC state actually know all these 祖傳秘方, the formula inherent within the family. So they were selling the same products, same formula, but under different names. But if we look at the sales and statistics, proprietary medicine, 成藥, from Hong Kong had a much higher rate and profit than those from mainland China's between 50s and 80s. The sales volumes of Hong Kong medicines was almost 20 times more than the mainland China products, as shown in the data in the 1950s. So to overseas consumers, they were actually consuming more about Hong Kong medicines than the mainland China one. So this trend is significant when we think about the role of Hong Kong. And from the 1980s, when open reform in mainland China happened, medical companies regained autonomy. They began to export and but found themselves in legal trouble. So 陳李濟藥廠 is the one I actually mentioned about. In 1997, the Hong Kong 陳李濟 submit a court case in Washington in the US against mainland 陳李濟 for infringing its copyright by exporting products and selling its products in the US using the name 陳李濟. And surprisingly, the Hong Kong branch in the end, with its trademark registrations in the US, won the court case and received compensation from the mainland branch. So from that moment, the 廣州陳李濟 cannot export and sell any products under the name of 陳李濟, and the Hong Kong branch cannot sell its product in mainland China. So these are not the only companies that have similar legal issues about copyright or trademark, but instead, when we think about Chinese medicines, the branches of Hong Kong indeed became independent, and to a certain extent, became the headquarters of this business during the Cold War. So these are the broader backdrops that I want you to know about Chinese medicines, but today my focus is medicinal trade, 中藥材貿易. So let me pull you back to the topics today. In a similar context from the early 20th century, merchant associations coordinated the trade of medicinal medicines in Hong Kong, connecting South China and Southeast Asia at a time. And yet, Hong Kong was rather marginal in all these trades. It was coordinated by 南北行. For those who don't know Chinese, 南北行 here means 南 means south and 北 here means north. So simply put, 南北行 means stores and businesses involved in export and import trade between the north and south. For the trade of medicinal materials, Southeast Asia and China were mostly involved. This basic information is essential for understanding why Hong Kong and other trade ports matter in sustaining the global consumptions of Chinese medicines. Herbs only grow and appear in specific weather and geographical environments. So in talking about Chinese medicines, there could be roughly divided into different types of herbs, and in the case here we're talking about 南藥 and 北藥, the north and south. So Hong Kong and other trade ports serve as a transit port for circulating 南北藥. It reflects the transnational natures and transregional natures of Chinese medicines. It has to cooperate herbs from multiple regions, and it largely depends on the trading networks to support the practice of Chinese medicines. So another important context is the trade embargo. Due to PRC China involvement in the Korean War, products merchandised or originating from China were banned from 1951. It means that most raw materials from China were also banned. But it is also well known that the trade embargo has a severe impact on Hong Kong, transforming Hong Kong economy into manufacturing, etc. However, it did not mean that the export-import trade between China and Hong Kong disappeared. Hong Kong's unique geopolitics made it one of the places the PRC could continue to export materials to Hong Kong. John Wong's, who is still having lunch perhaps, or somewhere else, his work has demonstrated, oh, he's here. Oh, you're here, okay. I can't see you, sorry. So his work also demonstrates how the Comprehensive Certificate of Origins, a system to regulate and register the origins of products, create a liminal space for Hong Kong's products, such as soybeans. In other words, Hong Kong had always been a loophole in the broader Cold War in import and export trade. This part remained crucial for us to think about what are actually made in Hong Kong in the history of medicinal trade. And the critical question here is how to practice Chinese medicines when the most essential materials came under strict state control and under trade embargo. So what I'm going to talk here about is the networks that facilitate the medicinal trade during the Cold War. And even to many practitioners at the time, they don't know much about all these underground or behind network that straddle between PRC China, Hong Kong, Southeast Asia, and the world, and are largely drawn from oral history and archives from different medical businesses to reconstruct and trace these networks. So geopolitics basically transformed the entire trade about medicinal materials and the practice. So under the planned economy in PRC China, Dak Sun Hong was the company attached to Chinese Resources, Huayuan. And Dak Sun Hong became the state agent to centralize the import and export of herbs in mainland China. It coordinated the national trade of herbs from various regions and centralized export-import like Tianjin, Shanghai, and Guangdong. So here's a map, a bit rough, that indicates how the medicinal trade was centralized in Hong Kong from mainland China. And in this way, Dak Sun Hong in Hong Kong could distribute different herbs to different ports based on product needs. And Hong Kong was the largest export cities of herbs under the planned economy. Dak Sun Hong would only trade the company in Hong Kong, will only trade with members of the PRC-related association in Hong Kong, Yi Tong. Yi Tong was a trade association with 18 members. These members would sign a contract with the PRC officials to monopolize the medicinal trade. Dak Sun Hong would also allocate different amounts of products to ensure the interests of all members. So to all the members, their commercial interests largely lay in their relationship with Dak Sun Hong. So here's a chart to show you how all these medicinal materials trickle from mainland China through to Hong Kong. So for instance, North America. One of my interviewees was a family member who operated a business of wholesalers, Paifa, of herbs. They would sometimes circumvent trade restrictions and smuggled herbs into US and Canada by mail. So they would send herbs in boxes before and after Christmas to circumvent any custom checking. And in this sense, all these wholesalers, what I'm tracking in my research is how these refiner wholesalers, Yi Tong, and different merchant associations structured all these trade networks. So if you look carefully, those encircled in the square means that how local Hong Kong merchants handle and refine all these products and send it out to different drugstores and companies for sales. So here are two primary sources that I also came across. So the left one is a receipt of Yi Tong. It's a formal way that you can deal with Yi Tong, as you can tell from the higher level of distributing herbs. And this is based on one of the archives from Luen Yik Hong and are a kind of wholesalers or Lam Bak Hong in Hong Kong as well. In 1959, when their relationship with Yi Tong, in the good terms, they could still directly get the herbs directly from Yi Tong. But when their relationship worsened or changed into somewhat indifferent, Luen Yik Hong still managed to find a way to get all the herbs from smugglings. For example, this is a receipt or consignments from the documents, and you can tell here they largely got the materials from Sui Ha, who crossing the border between Shenzhen and Hong Kong to get all these materials through an informal and illegal way. But the medicinal trade was one of the few things that transcend the Cold War tensions in Hong Kong. So the members of Yi Tong largely handle medicinal trade with mainland China and Southeast Asia, whereas the Hong Kong Chinese Medicine Associations, 中藥聯商會, who saw the nationalist government as the official Chinese state, would trade with Taiwan, Japan, and Korea. In particular, nationalist Taiwan also imposed trade restrictions with mainland China, and the chairman of the Chinese Medicine Association, 中聯商會, negotiated the term directly with the nationalist governments. And eventually, medicinal trade was possible if it received a license from the 中藥聯商會 to recognize its origins. So the same measure was also applied to Vietnam in the 60s and 70s, when the Chinese medical associations served as an informal body to issue certificate of origins. So simply put, in other words, these herbs from mainland China would be repackaged and refined, then received a certificate of origins, and eventually sent out to Vietnam and Taiwan. Here are another set of archives I'm looking at from the internal archives from Yuanseng, and you can tell how Yuanseng, as a company that actually have branches in Malaysia, Singapore, and Hong Kong, continue to export directly of all these herbs from Shanghai, Hamun, and Guangzhou at the same time, and all these receipts showing how much they got throughout the time. So here's a map that shows the trading connections of Yuanseng, how they circulate all these medicinal materials from mainland China to the world. So when mainland China was under trade embargo, local merchants in Hong Kong would export these herbs to Thailand, Taiwan, Europe, Japan, Korea, Indonesia, and North America. They had to adapt to different regional custom practice and developed formal and informal ways of shipping. But when I do more research about the Chinese medicines, things become more interesting if you look at the map. So from the 1970s, medicinal materials and proprietary medicines were shipped from Hong Kong to all these places: Nigeria, Jamaica, Panama, Trinidad, South Africa, and other places as well. And that account for around 5% of total trade in that year. And in particular, 1/5 of the Hong Kong-made proprietary medicines went into Nigeria in 1979, and which I just learned from Ria about our conversations, which is likely due to, in the 1970s, the PRC state sent a medical team to Africa for some kind of like a propaganda for introducing Chinese medicines to the African countries. But in reverse, Hong Kong also not simply received materials from China, but served as a global nexus for all sorts of materials from the world. For example, ambergris from USSR Long Yinheng, the kind of organs within the whale, shell and ivory from Singapore, Japan, or seafood, guozilei, from South America, etc. So during the Cold War, all these trades about medicinal materials congregate in Hong Kong with a professional industry of refining and exporting them. It is a struggle for me when I come to research this project, where to look for statistics. A category about Chinese medicines actually did not exist in colonial documentations. Zhongqiuye could be categorized in multiple areas, but could not simply be understood as medicinal medicines, including food, tea, animal bodies, and many other terms. But here's a brief statistics. In 1976, it accounts for $2.6 billion in total. As you can see from these items, it actually had a huge network of skills and profits in this era. The changing Sino-American relationship also played a large part here. We often talk about the ping-pong diplomacy, but one change brought by the changing relationship was the roles of traditional Chinese medicines. So not simply among the Chinese migrants over the world, but also American and European also interested in Chinese medicines in the 70s. When they cannot get into China in the 70s, they end up being in Hong Kong, Taiwan to learn about Chinese medicines. So as you can tell, in this year, in 1771, when the acupuncture was introduced to the US, you can tell the scale of the interest, even in local product, escalate. So here's another map indicating from the Guangdong province their perspectives, how the records of all these medicinal materials exported to Hong Kong change over time. As you can tell, it also associates with different countries, so it's a complex network. For example, in the Canton Fair, Guangzhou Gaoying, we was introduced a spike and also established trading relationship with Vietnam. It changed over time. So the reason why is it 70s is that the President Nixon trips to China made acupuncture and anesthesia, 針敍麻刺, to become a global phenomenon. People in the US and UK came to Hong Kong to look for the old masters to treat their pain and illnesses. And at the same time, the 70s was also a period of declining faith in biomedicines. It was also coincidence with the WHO promoting traditional Chinese medicines and African medicines as a different healing method, alternative to biomedicines. So to wrap up, the medicinal trade in Hong Kong changed and declined in the 80s as the reform and opening in mainland China. Farmers in mainland China could plant themselves and export and smuggle the herbs to Hong Kong in different ways. So that transformed the whole nature and ecosystem in Hong Kong and how that works. My focus here today is why medicinal trade matters in Hong Kong and how could it tell us about the broader history about global Chinese medicines. So ironically, the colony served as a safe space for the development of Chinese medicines as a source of foreign currency for PRC to exporting all these herbs to Hong Kong. And it also implicate how we could find a new way to understand the history of Chinese medicines beyond state perspectives and intellectual history. So that's the end of presentations. Thank you for staying.